Hello and wait, that's not capturing what we're trying to capture. That's not it. Hello and welcome back, everyone. We are going to be doing a little bit more reading of my book. I wrote Attention to Agency, and by wrote, we're kind of using it a little bit loosely, as you will be able to see some of the later portions, specifically the later chapters in here, which we are getting pretty deep, just have parenthetical asides representing stuff to fill out or flesh out. When you write a nonfiction book, you're not supposed to write the whole thing, and so the beginning is much more fleshed out, but we're going to be talking through these various things. If you are interested in any of the VODs from the earlier chapters, those are available on my Ideas YouTube, Generalist Ideas. But without further ado, let's start doing much more of this. So in each of these chapters, we have they come in two parts for the first 10 chapters, which is the odd number chapter outlining a problem, and then an even number sort of responding to the problem. And when we have this thesis that agency is effective action in the direction of your values, one of the problems is motivation. It's one thing to know what to do to construct a model of reality, and then have a various sort of strategy for approaching it. It's another thing to actually execute. And so this is kind of what we will be exploring a little bit today, although I wrote this quite a bit ago. So we have something must be done as the top up here, which is referring to a model from a previous a model of motivation or action from a previous chapter, which is there are three central beliefs of action. Something must be done. I can't change this. I must be the one to change this. And so we have the section I am. And this is a little bit of a mental exercise that we are going to put in here. But it is an interesting sort of thing, is if you create the sentence stem I am, and then you put ... and you follow it with a whole bunch of statements, what ends up happening at the end of that. And the idea here is not that we immediately use that, but that we set it aside. And so the idea is to encourage the reader to do this exercise. And I suppose if you're watching the VOD, you can do that now, where you write I am like 20 or so times, let's say, and then you complete the sentence as it's done. And so if you wanted to do that on the VOD, you can feel free to pause now, give that a try. But in case we don't end up getting back to it, and so you would want to be unpaused by the time we do this, it's an interesting sort of exercise because there are kind of two sorts of ways that people complete this sentence stem I am. One of which is they refer to individualistic characteristics, like I am strong, I am wise, I am silly, I am adventurous, I am, referring to individualistic traits, or it could even be referring to sorts of roles, like I am a welder, I am a teacher, I am a businessman, like these types of things. But it is interesting that people often refer to themselves in a variety of different ways, and the way that you think about yourself informs to some extent the actions that are going to look available to you. And so this is something we'll come back to, but one of my psychology professors, this was the crux of his dissertation, was doing an experiment with this, and what he discovered is differences between cultures, where some cultures would finish the sentence in a much more individualistic way, and some would finish the sentence in a much more communal way, referring to themselves, I'm a father, I'm a member of a community, this type of thing, versus I am a individual task I do or individual trait about myself. I think we might reference this back, but I'm not sure if we do. But I do think it's an interesting exercise to think about how it is we identify ourselves, because this is going to be the central thesis or thrust of the following chapter. It might only be the following chapter where we refer back to this. And next up is we have this chapter or the section unstable, which is going to kind of describe the ways in which who we think we are isn't necessarily as stable as it might seem at first blush. And for this, we are invoking the Zimbardo prison experiment, the famous Zimbardo Stanford prison experiment. Now, it has come to my attention since I've written this that Zimbardo himself had his finger on the scale a little bit more than I'm perhaps comfortable with to reference this, but this is also one of the most famous experiments that kind of shows off this idea, which is that our identity isn't as stable as we might like to think, and who we are isn't necessarily as concrete as we might like to think. And in this experiment, it was done with a bunch of college students, and they were randomly selected to be guards or inmates. They were screened to make sure that they were psychologically stable, and Zimbardo converted the basement of the psychology department into a mock jail. It had, various cells. There was rooms for, prisoners, and then there was also he himself was the warden. And the problem with this experiment is, one, he has inserted himself inside the experiment by making himself the warden, but also, two, he kind of was aiming to produce a particular result, which is he was aiming to have the guards kind of be as oppressive as possible. And this came out in a little bit more detail. I think there's a documentary on Netflix about it, where the guards talk about how Zimbardo encouraged them to be especially brutal. And the thrust of Zimbardo's experiment was supposed to be such that the relationship itself created this corruption. And I think that that is still, to some extent, the effect that gets produced. But I think that it's Zimbardo's experiment is maybe not so good for as an example of that because of the way in which it's tainted. But you see a similar thing in Abu Ghraib. But let's continue. The Zimbardo himself gave himself the role of warden, a decision he later regretted, and the students are mock arrested, processed, and this type of stuff. And in the results, they found that eventually the guards were humiliating and debasing all the inmates after just a few days. Now, again, probably problems with this study. If we go back and kind of finish up the book, either we will add some pretty heavy-handed footnotes to this, because I still think there are some other studies that we reference that have some problems but still describe the correct effect, and I think that the Zimbardo prison experiment is extremely prolific and still is maybe worth mentioning, but I'm not entirely sure. It wasn't the case that the sadistic and authoritarian students chose to be guards as a means of finding good placement for their dispositions. The students were randomly selected. The problem is that they were encouraged by Zimbardo. The roles that they were placed in shaped themselves. Now, I think that this is true, or would be true, but you could attribute more of the cause to Zimbardo, and so this undermines the argument. An argument can be made that prisoners outside of this experiment, having violated the laws of society, are perhaps deserving of contempt. The prisoners in this experiment, however, committed no wrongdoing. Their names were drawn from a proverbial hat that assigned them to be prisoners. They had done nothing to be deserving of their position, but were treated as if they were worthy of contempt. And here we see an as if we want to do a little bit rejoinder to the Pygmalion effect, which is if you have an expectation of someone else, then eventually this can encourage them to fill that expectation. And this was a study that was done by teachers, or it was done in a classroom environment where they gave the teachers two groups of students, and they said one group was supposed to be high achievers and the other was supposed to be low achievers, and the students were actually randomly assigned to the different groups. And I forget the name of the study, but what they found is by the end of the year, even though the students were randomly assigned to the group, the students that were assigned to the high achievers became the high achievers, and the ones that were assigned to low achievers became the low achievers, which suggests that the teacher's belief in regards to the achievement level of the students influenced the teacher to further influence the students to fulfill that. And the idea here is if you are treating someone as if they are a being worthy of contempt, they can in turn become a being that is worthy of contempt, is kind of, I think, the thing I wanted to suggest here, but I don't know if... or it will break the prisoners and teach them to act as if they are worthy of contempt, is probably a better way of phrasing that. This brings us back to the why Zimbardo positioning himself as the warden is so problematic. By making himself the warden, he placed himself inside the experiment, and in doing so, he blinded himself to the very type of bias he was setting out to observe. I think he might have had more of an agenda going into the experiment, but rather than just kind of being caught up in it, which is the narrative that he kind of describes when he talks about it publicly, which he does quite a bit. He is famous for this experiment. He no longer occupied the position of an experimenter or an impartial observer. He was the warden, he was on the side of the guards, he facilitated the deception of the prisoners' parents to show how bad the conditions in the mock jail really were. The Zimbardo prison experiment joins the Milgram experiment as one that is iconic in that it reveals the darker side of human nature, but is also considered too unethical to be replicated today. These are kind of the two most cited experiments in all of American psychology. In the Milgram experiment, we saw that humans were all too willing to conform to authority when it demanded to harm another individual. The Milgram experiment sought to understand how the atrocities of World War II were possible to answer the question of why no one in Germany tried to stop Hitler. Man, I wonder if this not capitalizing Hitler was intentional. It might have been. We found that people were all too willing to simply go along with authority. And then we talk about the predictions versus the results of the Milgram experiment, where they only predicted something like 7% would go all the way to the lethal level of shock, and it ended up being like 90% or just some very large figure. I can't remember the number. Maybe it was 70. But it was much larger than the predicted amount. Maybe the predicted amount was 3%. But for those of you who are not familiar with the Milgram experiment, they had an actor who was pretending to be shocked, and an experimenter, and the experimenter, when the actor answered the question wrong, would have to shock them with an increasingly high level of shock, and they were given the impression that the person that they were shocking was seriously hurt, but they were told by an authority figure to keep doing the experiment, and the real experiment was not a learning test, seeing how the shocks affected the actor's ability to learn, but rather it was a test to see how much of a shock that the person who was part of the experiment would be willing to give when just gently prodded by an authority figure. But continuing on, in some sense, the Zimbardo experiment revealed something even more unsettling than willingness to conform to authority. We want to have some sort of quote about power corrupting, this type of thing. No one told the students who were given the role of the guards to be sadistic, except for, here's the problem, since I've written this, I've discovered that this is not quite true. The motivation and impetus from their behavior come from within, or perhaps, or rather, from their socially derived conception of what a guard was, or ought to be. We wanted to talk about the Abu Ghraib. I think it's Ghraib, not Grad. Isn't it? There's Ghraib. That's pronounced. And that is a instance where American soldiers tortured prisoners in a humiliating fashion. I think less harm-oriented, more humiliation, and it was a scandal when a bunch of photos were released. But this is an instance where people who are placed in a position where they are guards and they have contempt of the people they are holding, it allows them to dehumanize them. And I think if I were to rewrite this section, I might focus a little bit more on Abu Ghraib rather than kind of the Zimbardo prison experiment. Another example is Frankl and the sadism of the capos. So Viktor Frankl was in an internment camp during World War II, and discussing the sadism of not the guards, but if I recall correctly, the capos were the Jews who kind of were a bit of defectors and assisted the guards, and that they were especially cruel relative to even the guards themselves, which is an interesting sort of headspace. So the problems and solutions in the block are largely intermixed, so we'll go over them briefly here and expand throughout both of the chapters. First is that motivation is needed for action. It's not enough to know how we can engage in constructive action, we have to want to. This can be further broken down into other concepts because other factors will affect our motivation. An area of particular concern in this endeavor is identity. And what we think of ourselves as will largely inform a wide variety of things, like the types of actions we consider available or legitimate for ourselves, but also not only legitimate, but even the types of actions that can enter our awareness, and also the types of standards of behavior that are acceptable for ourselves. So, for example, if you're a hairstylist, it's a very low probability that you are going to tolerate having a bad haircut yourself, right? And so this is a sense in which your identity informs the types of things you're willing to tolerate regarding yourself. If we aren't particularly well motivated to act, then we will need willpower to ensure action. This means we will have to set ourselves up with a model of how willpower works that will allow us to squeeze the most out of it. One problem is there's multiple kind of models of willpower in psychology. I'm not sure. I think we discussed this, but we'll see. We can set ourselves up to use less willpower as well. The second, as shown in Zimbardo's experiment, is that identity informs actions. It informs them in two ways. First, in terms of motivation, as we discussed, and second, in terms of availability. We can only take actions that enter our attention, and who we think we are regulates what potential actions enter our attention. The capos engaged in action a lot of us would consider unthinkable, but they became available to the capos. We occupy a role, and that role primes us. So much in the same way that if you tell someone stuff like bed, nighttime, dream, they will be more likely to kind of select sleep out of a word bank of kind of things. If you give someone the role of prison guard, they will be more likely to think of the actions that are associated with being a prisoner's guard in their mind. For our purposes, we'll think of identity as shifting over time, much like neuroplasticity can shift the physical makeup of the brains. I think it not only shifts over time, but it's actually hugely context-driven because the social context in which we find ourselves often informs the identity with which we kind of assign to ourselves. Like, if we're in a supermarket, we're a supermarket customer, and we enter that role of that particular kind of thing. But then when we're at work, we're whatever our profession is in this type of thing. When we're with our parents, we're like our parents' kids, like this type of stuff. And so it's not just that it's like shifting over time and is this kind of beacon of who we are and that just happens to move, but is highly malleable depending on social situation. It's mostly stable, has constraints, but can change and will change. Identity can be broken down or thought of as several different components. We will look at values, roles, and archetypes as different models through which we represent our identities to ourselves. So willpower. If we know what to do and how to do it, then the only problem remains getting ourselves to do it. Shout out to New Year's. Sorry, my voice is kind of scratchy because I already recorded something this morning. It's best if we simply want to do the things we think we ought to or need to achieve our goal. But what if we don't want to? What if we don't want to? Then we will need to use another resource in our arsenal, willpower. Attention is finite. Is willpower? Perhaps one of the most famous experiments that set out to test willpower, and we will see just how valuable it would be. I think it's the marshmallow test, yeah. This marshmallow test also has some problems that we've discovered, although I think we might have been aware of the problems, so we might talk about it. The idea is they take a child and they put a marshmallow on a plate in front of him and basically give him 0 things to entertain himself, and they leave him alone for 15 minutes, but before they do, they tell him if he can refrain from eating the marshmallow for 15 minutes, he will instead receive 2 marshmallows. And so the idea is that if you will achieve a better outcome if you show some amount of willpower. The main takeaway that is cited from this study is the ability to delay gratification is one of the best predictors of success. Now, I think that this might be the problem that we were going to discuss in this study, is that one of the confounds is that children who have an easier time believing adults and parents will also overperform on this test. And so what they might be testing is not necessarily the students' sort of willpower, but instead the level of trust with which they have for adults, and that to an extension that the experimenter. And if they don't trust that they'll necessarily get 2 mallows, which is kind of what you want the double mallow, then you will be more likely to just eat the marshmallow in front of you, because like a bird in hand is better than 2 in the bush type of thing. There's another study, the radishes and the cookie study. I forget the exact sequence of this, but I believe students or the people who are getting experimented on, which to be fair is students, it's almost always students, are given an opportunity to eat radishes or cookies, and I think the control group is told not to eat the cookies, or I think that's the experiment. I can't remember. But what this was shown is that the ones who had eaten the cookies were more able to persist on a task, an impossible task, I believe was the experiment, for a longer period of time. So they're not really testing to see if you can solve it. They're testing to see how long you will persist in an impossible program, which is very insidious. But what they found is the ones who first resisted the urge to eat the cookies versus the ones that indulged in the cookies, or maybe it was they had to resist cookies versus resisting radishes. But in either case, the one that had to use willpower to resist would spend less time in attempting to perform the impossible task, which is indicative of a phenomenon known as ego depletion, wherein a person, if they spend more willpower in one area, they will have less kind of available in another. It's important to note that radishes were used as a control for something unappealing. This relates back to our previous idea of disgust. If we think of the cookies as being disgusting, then resisting them wouldn't cause ego depletion. Identity, to some extent, informs disgust. And so if we don't think of the cookies as an option or something that's tempting, then yeah, they're not going to cause a problem. And identity, in a key piece of feature, informs disgust. So, like an example being the hairdresser, being a hairdresser would be disgusted by the notion of having a Barrett haircut. Another example might be a vegan who, if you put a cookie in front of them that they knew had butter in it, they would not experience ego depletion in order to resist eating the cookie, because for them, eating the cookie is not a choice, and it might even disgust them. But if you put an Oreo in front of them, which is a cookie that vegans can eat, they might experiencing that ego depletion. So if you have the identity of being a vegan, then this will inform like some of the situation, or like it can inform whether or not you're spending willpower in a certain situation. And so if we manage to change our identity in such ways that some things don't look like options, or some things inspire a sense of disgust in us, we can make it so that we won't have to use as much willpower. So becoming vegan, for example, would make it easier to resist eating cookies that are filled with lard. On the flip side of things, there's research to indicate that willpower is not finite, so there is mixed research. I'm not sure which study we wanted to take a look at, but the idea and model of willpower is that it functions a little bit more like emotion, in which case it's kind of like a feeling, and you can feel one way one time or another way another time. Just like the Rosenthal study, where the teacher's beliefs regarding students' intelligence affects outcomes, so too does our conception of willpower affect our willpower. I think there was... I'm trying to remember the study, but I think there was a study where people were tasked with reading... Oh, man, I can't... I believe people were tasked with reading a essay or kind of snippet that argued that willpower was infinite, and then another one that argued that it was finite. And then after reading each of these, they were asked to perform a task. They thought the task was completable, but it was really an impossible task, and they were just testing to see how long they would persist in an impossible task. And the ones who had been primed with the idea that willpower is infinite persisted on the task for longer. The problem is both these stories of willpower hinge on the placebo effect. I think that's going to be in reference to the metadata study, and maybe the metadata study is the one we're thinking of. But okay. Well, what does this mean for us? In the face of two models regarding whether willpower is finite or an emotion, how should we represent willpowers to ourselves? If you were to make a payoff matrix for it, you'd see that getting the willpower question wrong in both cases is pretty unpalatable. And this is something we talked about in a previous chapter, where we kind of construct a payoff matrix where we say reality is one way or another. It's either that willpower is finite and willpower is not finite, and our belief is one way or the other. Either we believe willpower is finite or we believe it's infinite. And getting it wrong when in terms of it comporting with reality in both situations is going to be not very helpful. If we think of it as finite and it's not, we impose the finitude on ourselves via the Pygmalion effect. So if we think it's finite and it turns out it's not, then we will have a placebo. Let's say placebo. I think that's a little bit more accessible. At the same time, if we think it's not finite, and it is, we won't treat it as a scarce resource, and we will be apt to use it in a way that isn't strategic. However, the upside of viewing it as not finite when it is indeed not finite is particularly large relative to getting it right when it is finite. To believe that willpower is finite when it is just just means being strategic with willpower and treating it like a scarce resource. To believe that willpower is limitless fountainhead when it is to be unleashed. This certainly sounds appealing. If we were to look at it from an EV perspective, that would be the best choice because the upside is so large. But we can do a little bit better. We can frame willpower in such a way that is effective enough so that we can accommodate both perspectives, or we can try and figure out which model is correct. I encourage you to stop reading and consider this. Consider how to do it? Interesting. I think framing willpower as an emotion, to some degree, dodges the question of whether or not it's finite. And then we wanted to say some stuff about running out of mood or being a taxing mood, increasing patience. If our mood is right and we are well aligned, our willpower will be uncapped. But we should prepare for times when we're not in the mood and form habits of effective processes for being efficient with willpower. Strategies for being not in the mood. We can think of, be more efficient and try and pick our spots in the event that we're not in the mood. It might, for example, be more worthwhile use of our willpower to inform ourselves on nutrition than trying to brute force diet. This is an interesting kind of thing where I think that brute force dieting relative to reading a book on dieting, if you've never read a book on dieting, is probably not very effective. Reading a book a month and letting the disgust work its magic. The idea being that when you read a book that like kind of villainizes most diets or dieting fads or dieting books villainize a particular thing, whether it's like fats or animal products or sugars or whatever it is. and go out pretty far out of their way to do it, such that that thing might produce a little bit of a disgust response for you. It can be easier, like reading a book is only like 10 hours. It can be easier to read a book, perhaps, than it can be to use all the willpower you have to resist eating particular things. We can self-prime willpower through predecisions. Predecisions help to cut us off from alternatives, and we can do this ahead of time. And then using implementation intentions, which I think we have covered in a previous chapter, which has the structure of if you kind of read a piece of paper or you write out, if I encounter X scenario, then I will do Y. Doing this ahead of time dramatically increases the probability that you're going to do Y when faced with X. And so it helps on ego depletion tasks. So if the readers who were resisting the cookies had written down on a piece of paper, if I am feeling like I cannot do a task because that task is impossible and you can't do it, then I will sit with it and persist. Like if you do that ahead of time, then even if you experience the ego depletion, it makes it easier for you to persist in the task. But framing as an emotion gives us something big in terms of what sort of attitude we should have towards willpower. If willpower is an emotion, or operates like one, then we can apply the same sort of ideas that we do for emotions, to view it as an ecosystem in that it influences us and we influence it, and aim to embody to whatever extent we can, and to prime that given emotion. Last chapter we talked a bit about how we aren't in direct control of our emotions, and so what to the extent that we can influence emotions, we have to do stuff proactively, but at the large, kind of in a large sort of sense, we should accept emotions when they are coming to us in real time, and it is only like proactively that we can really do stuff regarding emotions. Okay. Distraction. Willpower isn't the central problem of this block, but we can look at some practical solutions that don't relate to the solution of alignment. To be on track is to have traction, and then we're going to reference influence and hacking back the environment. There's a book by Nir Eyal called Indistractable that I think we were looking to reference here. I've since become less bullish on that author, and I don't even know if I would want to talk about him, and this entire section might get removed. I'm not sure. Okay, next up is story life. And there's an interesting cognitive bias in regards to story, and it was painful water study, so let's kind of get through it. How we determine meaning of our lives is largely actually through the stories we tell ourselves rather than the real lived experience of our lives. The way in which we value stories of our lives relative to the lived experience of our lives is rather surprising. And there's an interesting study where, so one of the ways in which they induce pain, it's still considered to be ethical, is with water, where they giving contrasting heat of water in particular is a nice way to induce pain but cause zero damage to the body. And I think it's like they submerge you in cold and they submerge your arm in hot water, or like you're submerged in cold water and then your arm's in like a bag that has heat or something like this. But what they found is pretty interesting, where if the numbers aren't going to be exactly the correct here because I'm trying to remember the study, but it's something like if you're in a painful situation for 10 minutes, and that situation's like a 10, like it's really painful, but then it's followed by a 5-minute period of not being painful or as painful, like let's say a 6 out of 10 rather than a 10 out of 10, you will actually prefer that, or studies indicate you'll prefer that to an entirely 10-minute painful situation, even though you suffer more in the kind of earlier situation because you're just adding on 5 minutes of intensity 6 pain onto it. And the reason why is because of the recency effect, because the story we tell ourselves about how badly it hurts is largely informed by a cognitive bias towards recency, which is that we think of what happened most recently as kind of the experience we had. And so it's us telling the story of ourselves, not actually us knowing or really, really understanding how badly it hurts. Because we would choose to repeat the first situation instead of the second one, even though it has more overall net pain. I'm not sure what the colonoscopy study I wanted to invoke is, and I'm not 100% sure about ripping off the bandages, other than it might be the case that... I don't know what this refers to. I mean, all of these are going to refer to some sort of effect where the amount of net pain or discomfort that is experienced is going to be higher in one situation, but people will still prefer that situation because of how they can, because of either primacy effect or the recency effect, giving them the illusion of sorts, or the distortion, the cognitive distortion, that they aren't experiencing as much pain, like preferring 10 minutes plus of 10 pain 10 experience followed by 5 minutes of pain 6 to just only having pain 10. There's another interesting study where, there is like 2 stories get read to an individual, and the individual has to decide which one is more sad, or in which one the person got to live a more fulfilling life. And this goes to multiple biases, like the availability heuristic as well. But the idea is they get one story about a man, like, let's say he's in his 20s, that his lover is sick in the hospital, and he goes to visit her, goes like super out of his way, this type of thing, and is able to, visit her before she dies. And another scenario where a man, and the subjects don't get to see these 2 experiments, they have to, or these 2 stories, they have to rate them in the abstract. And so it's comparing the average of how they rank each of these stories in the abstract with 2 separate groups. But the second story that gets fed to the groups is one in which the person, instead of the people of being like in their 20s, they're in their 70s. And instead of making it to the hospital in time, the man does not make it to the hospital in time, and his wife dies without him. And the question is on like a scale of 1 to 10, who had the more fulfilling life, or how fulfilling a life was this person's? Because importantly, they did not get to see these 2 stories side by side. They were ranking the stories in a vacuum. And the group of people who ranked the story of the 20-year-olds versus they actually ranked that life as being more fulfilling. But if you like analyze them side by side, obviously you would prefer the extra 50 years of life, and then your person doesn't make it to the hospital in time in terms of how fulfilling was your life/relationship. But it's the story of not making it to the hospital in time that informs our evaluation in a negative way. Like, we do not evaluate it in an objective sort of way, and instead we evaluate based on kind of the story we can tell ourselves about events or this type of thing. And so we are, the way we inform ourselves or tell ourselves about our life is not based on our actual lived experience, but it's based on like a set of stories. It's not just that this would be considered irrational behavior, it's irrational in a particular and consistent way. This raises, which is a bias towards stories versus lived experience. This raises a question that's both interesting and important. What is important when it comes to addressing the quality of one's life? Should we value our story, our lived experience, or some amalgamation of the 2? Are we, for example, better off experiencing more pain in the mathematical sense in order that our memory, and thus the story of that pain, is diminished, like choosing the more painful option or the time in which we experience more pain via the water pain study. Where should we apply our efforts and goals? Should we try and improve our lived experience or sacrifice our lived experience for a better story? It's tempting to look at the lived experience as being real and the story as being merely a mental construct. The problem is that most, if not all, of our experience is mentally constructed. Much of the discussion in the book is addressing just that. Here, let's italicize this. Recall the optical illusions and how perception in the brain is trying to make sense of sensation, and how the brain is fully capable and does things to fill in the blanks and distort things. The story is how we process reality. We can't just throw it out. And then, let's see. We wanted to reference point cognitive bias. I don't have an example for it off the top of my head. That there's so many questions in this section belies my own uncertainty. I don't know the best way of interpreting or deciding what is important in this regard. I am left with a sort of payoff matrix that tells me when I can be efficient at improving lived experience in my life, I ought to do so, and when I can be efficient at improving the story of my life, I ought to do so. Though I imagine I lean more towards a lived experience as being more important, but that it won't feel that way. You might reach different conclusions. I think uncertainty leaves us with a little bit of upside of a reframing tool in that we can focus on lived experience in times of particularly tragic or disempowering story. And conversely, if our lived experience is particularly unpalatable, we can focus on our own story. The lived experiences of the concentration camp were horrible. Frankl focused on the storied practices of suffering well as his future story of writing about his ideas of logotherapy and experiences in the camp, again, concentration camp. Frankl's role as a psychologist may have positioned him in a way uniquely well for this sort of reframing. We want an example of focusing on lived experience, but we don't have one. Even if we can't pick out one as being primarily important, we can think about and focus on improving both in our practice. That is, both the stories which we tell ourselves about our life and also the lived experience about our life. Not sure what intro is referring to. Or just try to intro this paragraph. We ought to still recognize this story bias and account for it in our practice. Specifically, we ought to recognize that we are prone to undervaluing things that improve our lived experience, but don't make for much of a story. There we go. A lot of ways in which we can optimize our health, as well as being more intentional with our embodiment, fall in this category. Stuff like taking a multivitamin is not particularly sexy. Going on walks is not particularly sexy. It doesn't make for a good story. This type of stuff. Did I already say taking a multivitamin? Taking a multivitamin to me is like the best example because it's like the effort is so close to zero. But it's not sexy. Let's pause and consider a story of a hero and a villain. Feeling good because of a victory over a perceived foe makes for a better story than feeling good because we spent 30 minutes reading with a pencil between our teeth, which is one of the injunctions we suggest last chapter, which forces you to smile. But if both achieve the same effect in terms of lived experience, how important is the path we choose? One should obviously be more within our scope of control. We can control the process of the pencil of our teeth, but we can't ensure the victory over a foe. Further, the former option of victory over a foe necessitates that we have one. There's a Nietzsche quote I really like, where it's like, I forget. Just paraphrasing. It's like, he who fights monsters has like an incentive that the monsters remain or something, or has incentive that there be monsters. Something to this effect. And the fact that if we want to have a story about dominating over foes, we create in that a necessity for having foes, which might not be the best way of interpreting or going through life. The second thing, as far as our practice goes, is that we need to be both aware of and intentional about the stories we tell ourselves about our life. We already saw that to some extent with the explanatory style and the Stoics. With explanatory style, we see that the lens, or perhaps narrative style, that we ought to use if we want to avoid hopelessness is one that is optimistic. If we tell ourselves, "This is the end of my story, I have failed, my time is over," then that paints a picture that doesn't set us very well up for agency. It's a story of learned helplessness, but if we always have hope, even in a hopeless situation, then our story can continue. We can even frame adversity as part of the story that makes it more interesting. Stories that are entertaining always have conflict, whether or not it's with other people, nature, or ourselves. If they didn't, they'd be uninteresting. The Stoics give us a frame of what we ought to focus on. To use the life as a story metaphor, we ought to follow the hero of our story more closely and constrict our focus down to the things we, the hero, have control over. Those were more about structure and substance of what they captured regarding external, internal, responsible, not responsible, etc. Well, I'm not sure what I even mean here, or what I meant to expand. Okay. There's a point we have already covered that's very important to emphasize here. Stories are mentally constructed. They are useful, like metaphors, in that they make reality coherent for us, but in a theoretical sense, they don't exist. We can't point to some physical object and say, that's a story. Stories are the tool that facilitate our ability to make sense of reality and give us direction and purpose. In a sense, the difference between stories and lived experience is a little like the difference between perception and sensation, respectively. What sensation looks at without perception is, in fact, pure chaos. In some sense, living without stories would be living in pure chaos. And so, this is, if you study perception, I think there's, like an image even, like, if you don't have the brain really interpreting sense perception, what you would get is just like, it would look like white static in terms of like visually. And your brain is really, truly basically constructing all the objects and making sense out of just a blinding array of light, and does a huge part to make objects appear discrete as individual entities and this type of stuff. And that our brain is doing this in the perception of vision is entirely concealed from us, because it is always doing it. It is always making sense of this jumbled chaos of light. But our perception, which is what our brain experiences, is different than our sensation, which is what reaches our eyeballs. And in some sense, living without stories would be living with just the sensation and without the perception, which would be just a chaos of light. Extensions of non-narrative aspects of stories, roles, and values. So the idea here is that roles and values are sorts of stories we tell ourselves about ourselves that are not narrative in nature. We're free to interpret reality as we like, and a metaphor that we are the hero of our own story, that can be a useful metaphor or not. Roleplay and dissonance. Identity informs practice, and we wanted to talk about the Pygmalion effect a little bit more, which we've already mentioned, so we'll kind of just breeze over that. Consider the roles of the individuals involved in the Milgram experiment, which are the ones who repeatedly shocked the other person they thought was in the experiment, but unbeknownst to them, they were an actor. These people are primed for compliance. And some of these people view themselves as a fellow citizen, and some of the responses that they wouldn't take it all the way, rather than being, merely someone who is running the experiment for the experimenter who asks that they repeatedly shock them. We wanted to reference the Zimbardo prison experiment here, but I'm not sure what we wanted to say about it. We talked about cognitive dissonance when we talked about conformity. How in the Burns study, a lack of cognitive dissonance in individuals seemed to indicate that social pressure was changing very perception, not merely how individuals reported that perception. We wanted to explain cognitive dissonance a little bit better. So cognitive dissonance is when your perception of reality does not comport with your beliefs about reality. And so when you are experiencing something that violates your worldview, you experience cognitive dissonance. And either you have to do kind of one of three things. I think it's three things. You have to like not think about it anymore, so you just avoid. You have to either update your worldview, or you have to reinterpret the events that are unfolding in front of you such that they remain comporting with your worldview. And the problem is that often when experiencing cognitive dissonance, the hardest thing to do is to update your worldview. And people tend to either ignore things when they experience information or they get information that violates their worldview, or they will find a way to explain it to themselves in such a way that their worldview remains unkind of challenged. And so very often people do this with confirmation bias, where if they receive evidence of something they disagree with in terms of their worldview, they will look for information until they find information that comports with their worldview and explains away the other evidence. Because you can find evidence for almost anything, this means people very often act in bad faith. And the second they have enough evidence to explain away the thing that is violating their worldview, they stop searching for evidence. And this is a very key point, because sometimes you can find a bit of evidence that fits your worldview and then you stop thinking about it. But if you just instead said, I'm going to collect evidence for 10 hours or something like this regarding this phenomenon, you would get more data points on both sides, and you would be able to compare and contrast instead of just looking for the first available thing. But also, like, what people do very often is they will just Google something that disagrees with their worldview, and they will phrase the Google search in such a way that they are brought evidence that supports their worldview, and then they'll just stop looking. And so, in a way, cognitive dissonance is not often solved by an updating of worldviews. That is kind of the more rare way in which it's solved. Okay. This is cognitive dissonance. I assume this is, I think I know the argument I'm trying to make here, is also one of the reasons why we're able to win money from people playing poker. We want to think of ourselves well if we're optimistic, and dissonance distorts our evaluation of our skill. So what happens in poker is when you're winning, you think it's because you're so good. And when you're losing, you find an alternative way to explain it to yourself, and often the explanation is, I'm just getting unlucky. And we create this sort of phenomena where we think our winning is 80% due to our skill and our losing is 80% due to our luck. And we have this distorted perspective on reality because we don't want to update, in light of the evidence, the belief that we are good at poker or bad at poker. Sometimes it is, but it's true for wins as well. So under-attributing, often you will under-attribute wins if you're playing poker to your level of luck. Sometimes you pull a really big bluff on someone and you're like, wow, that's crazy, I'm so good, I'm so stylish, I'm so handsome. And you were bluffing, but they were bluffing too, and you just blew them off of their bluff. They're like, well, I can't continue. And it just happens that you ran into them having a bad hand, and that is an instance of luck that you never get to see. And if they had a really good hand, if they had the best hand possible, for example, it wouldn't matter how skilled your bluff is, they're not coming off the hand. How we conceive of ourselves will inform, by the way, that would be unlucky if they just have the very, very best hand, but when they also have a terrible hand, that's also lucky for you. But how we conceive of ourselves will inform what prompts cognitive dissonance. As we saw, cognitive dissonance can lead to us to distort reality. when we are faced with an inconsistency between our behavior and who we think we are, something has to give. We change our behavior, this would be ideal, but we can also change our perception of what it is between what we think our behavior is or our identity. And so, in this case, the reality is our behavior, and what our worldview is that we are distorting is who we think we are. Consider a moment, here we use the hairdresser example, which we used earlier. Consider a moment the role of hairdresser or hairstylist. Presumably, one sees their task, in this case styling hair, as important. Further, the hairstylist considers themselves, if not expert, at least competent in such matters. If the hairstylist in the moment, if the hairstylist has bad hair in the moment and is going out, and they are aware of their bad hair, they're likely to experience severe dissonance at the notion of going out without fixing their hair. They consider the task of fixing up hair as important and one they are capable of. In all likelihood, the dissonance will be resolved by a change in behavior, them fixing their hair, rather than a change in beliefs regarding either their capacity or the importance of good hair. A mechanic that is likely to be more punctual about changing their oil. A botanist is more likely to take good care of their plants. There's this interesting phenomenon where specialists tend to over-evaluate their own specialty. And this is pretty interesting to me in that there's only like one batch of scientists. Wow, I'm surprised no one has chatted this entire time, but I guess we get to go through it faster. But there's actually only one branch of scientists that thinks the dinosaurs were not wiped out by a giant meteorite. Does anyone have a guess what that branch of scientists is? And instead, what that scientist does is they overvaluate kind of their own sphere of what they think is important. And so that group of scientists think that the dinosaurs were killed by another way. Now, to be fair, they are the most competent in their ability to evaluate whether or not the dinosaurs were killed in that way, in the particular way that pertains to their specialty. But simultaneously, they, as a result of overvaluing their specialty, they also have a bias towards thinking that their specialty is important in explaining events. And so it creates this weird kind of thing where the people who are the very experts in the thing are always also likely to overvalue that thing. And I thought about this a lot during the pandemic because the epidemiologists are the people who know the absolute most about the spread of disease. Simultaneously, they are the people who are most likely to overvalue kind of the importance of stopping the spread of disease relative to other sorts of considerations, because that is their very specialty, is regarding the spread of disease. And so what you would need in terms of like someone to properly evaluate, you know, what to do in the pandemic would be people who have a variety of multiple knowledge in multiple disciplines. You would need someone who is both an epidemiologist and an economist to actually properly weigh whether or not you should be the importance of economic trade-offs versus epidemiological trade-offs. And similarly, the economist would have the other bias where it's the economy that's the important thing, and you can't really have this sensitivity towards, epidemiological concerns. And so none of you guessed it, but the scientist that thinks that the dinosaurs were wiped out in another sort of way, although to be fair, this is something I would want to fact check a little closer before putting it in a book, is geologists think that the dinosaurs were killed by a massive volcanic eruption. A giant volcano in Russia, particularly. And if not geologists writ large, at least a geologist that I had spoken to, which is a bit interesting. But it also, makes sense that if your specialists are overvaluing their specialty, that you create this type of effect. Which isn't to say that it's not how the dinosaurs were killed, but if every other scientist think it was a meteorite, if the shoe was on the other foot, And it was just, the astrophysicists who thought the dinosaurs were killed by a meteorite, and everyone else thought it was a volcano. Yeah. Wanted to talk about tribalism here. Tribalism, if we were to rewrite this book, would probably be much more of a feature now than it was then. Cognitive dissonance puts us at a particular kind of risk. Demonizing the other as a means of justifying our cruelty. So often, negative behavior towards the other is justified. If we have a negative behavior and it's towards someone we identify as an other, very often what will happen if we experience cognitive dissonance regarding how we treat other human beings, it's not resolved by people decreasing their cruelty or avoiding from their cruelty, and instead resolved by thinking less of the group of whom is an object of the cruelty, and in do so you rationalize that behavior. And so this is one of the ways in which this is done. Do you think the lack of polymaths is a failure of the modern education system? I'm not sure, because the problem is that knowledge needs to be increasingly specialized in a lot of ways. Because in order to actually properly reach the depth of knowledge of various spheres is way more specialized now than it used to be. And so for some questions, it's a matter of it takes 10 years to actually figure it out. And this is really, really a lot more apparent in medicine, where you have doctors that are like left-hand specialists. Like, they only operate on left hands, but boy, they're really good at operating on left hands. Like, that's the joke, but like, you get doctors that are super, super hyper specialized in just particular types of surgeries, and man, oh man, they're really, really good at that. And you get people who are highly, highly specialized that are just really good at the particular thing. But yeah, to some extent, I think that there's a failure of the market to incentivize and reward being a polymath. Yeah, because it's the specialists that get economical rewards, and there's not as often, it seems to me, a reward for the type of person who like would have been the type of person we need in act during the pandemic, which is a person who has a PhD in epidemiology and a PhD in economics, and is well versed in both, but is still going to not really be able to push the boundaries of either discipline with their specialization, right? Their value is in their synthesis rather than their specialization. And so, yeah, I think that there is a lack in that regard, and that I don't know how you properly economically incentivize it, though, because for the most part, being the cutting edge of your specialty is more valuable. There was a boys' camp study where they got two groups of boys to be increasingly tribal towards the other group of boys, such that they eventually got violent, and the experimenters effectively facilitated or created this tribalism, and then over the latter part of the experiment, they de-escalated it and forced them to work together with the other group. And so there was a cooperative rejoinder. If we need to process our lives through stories, and those stories need conflict, it isn't necessarily the case that we have to have conflicts with other people, aka tribalism. This is another thing, is one of the reasons why I think tribalism happens is because humans kind of have a tendency to construct things in terms of narratives. Narratives often require an antagonist, especially if you aren't going to be able to construct a nuanced narrative where, like, it's a mixture of good guys and bad guys that are not really good and not really bad. If you really need simplistic narratives and that's all you can support, it's just good and evil, and these are the types of narratives you, let's say, like in entertainment, then I think you're more likely to construct a version of reality where you look at people as good and evil. And one particular thing I have a problem with Disney, although this is much less the case of Disney, I guess, in the last 10 to 15 years, is they portray a world in which people are either good or evil in a very kind of unambiguous way. and this is older Disney movies in particular that I'm thinking about. But when kids watch a bunch of these, I think that they learn to create like this polarized narratives themselves. And so when like Lauren doesn't want to play hopscotch with Becky, Becky doesn't become someone who's just disinterested in playing hopscotch or maybe even nervous about playing with a new friend. Instead, I mixed up who was Lauren and who was Becky. But the point is that Becky becomes the spawn of Satan rather than just being another child that just didn't want to play hopscotch. It's because if you can only construct narratives where people are good and evil, this is how Becky becomes, the bane of Recess, who is like the supreme manifestation of evil, because for you, you're attracted to that type of narrative. And I think that these types of narratives that are like simple and less nuanced and have like good and evil, I think that this is like one of the huge drivers of like tribalism, is this like kind of tendency within people. But let's continue. Rejoinder to conformity studies. We saw how distortion could even precede dissonance, which is to say that what you visually see, because you get sensation. Sensation hits your eyes. Your eyes send a message to your brain, and then your brain, through that mass of chaos, produces perception. They produce what you see. And we know that cognitive dissonance and the distortion, we know that the distortion of what we are seeing can occur before we even have the perception, and if our perspective of reality is distorted, and we don't even have the opportunity for it to challenge our view of reality because it's been distorted by our expectations, then this is a whole nother layer to the problem. If both social preferences and the roles we perceive as ourselves are going to put so much pressure on us, then we ought to be as intentional as possible with our roles. And so we are saying that social pressure and our roles are going to distort our very perception of reality in a way that is invisible to us. In particular, the experiment we're referring to involved the rotation of three-dimensional objects, and what they found is that if everyone in the group of like 20 people or something responded that the object was not the same object or was the same object, even if it was not the case, and even if it was easy enough to discern, this would warp the person who is being studied, because the other 20 people are actors. This would warp their perception to the extent that they wouldn't even experience the cognitive dissonance. They did this with brain scans. And this is key and important, because if this distortion can happen, not only are we having all these problems where we're talking about cognitive dissonance getting resolved through bad faith types of ways, not only do we have this, we have an additional layer where we might not even get the cognitive dissonance to begin with, because our perception gets warped. And it's getting warped by, social pressure as per the experiment, but also the roles we perceive ourselves to have and the story we tell ourselves about ourselves. So if this is going to put so much pressure, then we should be intentional with the roles we perceive ourselves. So how are we to think of identity? And there's a lot of different models of identity, but the one I think is most robust is the bundle theory of identity, which doesn't make for as good a story as some other things. But the Zimbardo prison experiment revealed a sort of instability with identity. All those students were aware that they were still students, and they were part of the psychology experiment, yet they still embodied roles that were randomly given to them. It isn't unreasonable to believe that the effect of occupying the role of a sadistic guard would have a more unreasonable to believe that the effect of occupying the role of a sadistic guard would have been more pronounced had they been actual guards and not just students role-playing them. Again, there's some problems with the studies. Makes a lot of sense. I haven't watched all the earlier chapters, but if you haven't read them, Why Honor Matters and Games Agency as Art seems like relevant reading. Those are relevant. I think those are on those look familiar, but I haven't read them. I think they might be on like to read lists. And then here we have where we were going to attack Abu Ghraib, which, has the American soldiers highly dehumanizing prisoners. And a big part of that is, I think, the us versus them sort of mechanic in terms of them mechanic. Let's make it sound like a video game. Sort of pattern that, occurs. We took a look at why identity is important, but what is it like? How do we formulate our identities? And so there's a Pearl theory of identity, which states that you have, at the heart of you, you have an individual essence that is immutable and characteristically and necessarily you, and that's kind of like the pearl of your existence or your identity, and that's fundamentally you. And so there is a thought experiment regarding using the ship of Argo, the ship of Theseus, from ancient Greek mythology that bore him and his company on their travels. If the mast breaks and we replace the mast, is it still the same? Then it's the same ship. If we also replace the rudder, it remains the Argo. But what if we replace every part of the ship? Is it still the same ship? And if not, then at which point did it become a different ship? What does it even mean to be the same ship? Even should probably be in here. The ancient Greek philosopher Heraclitus, shout out to man being the measure of all things, said that we can never step in the same river twice. His objection was not regarding the physical capability of stepping in the water. It was one of identity, that would not be the same river, nor us the same individual. He believed that everything is in flux, that our behavior should be greatly influenced by the roles we consider ourselves to occupy, should at least give us some pause in regards to identity. And so we wanted to have a rejoinder on personal change here, because one of the things is, if identity is, immutable, or if identity is mutable and there's some essential element, then you can't change it. But if it's malleable, then you can actively aim to change it to make it so that you are going to have better outcomes in terms of what causes cognitive dissonance for you, in regards to your behavior being inconsistent with your identity. And if this is going to warp your perspective, then being intentional about the way in which it's going to warp your perspective is something that is going to be useful for you. And so this means that you would want to be more active in selecting your identity. I think a lot of people think that this is being inauthentic, but we have a rejoinder in here, and I think it's probably in the next chapter, but the rejoinder is, if you live according to values rather than like a sort of identity you perceive as yourself, sometimes those values necessitate you changing, and sometimes they necessitate you becoming a different person. But let's continue. That's what authenticity is going to be in here, and I'm not sure if I've covered it already, but that's kind of like one of the arguments against change, especially change regarding identity. People are like, "Oh, that's not me," and it's like, not only is change possible, it's impossible to not change, and we're just changing over the course of our lives. And so the that ain't me kind of belief, I think, is a rather limited one. But anyways, Julian Baggini provides a different sort of explanation on how we formulate our identities in the book, The Ego Trick. He argues that we have no sort of pearl or essence that locks us down as who we are. Instead, he provides a theory known as bundle theory. The bundle of sticks is a metaphor. The idea is that we are mostly who we were yesterday, but we change a little bit every day. Identity is only stable over short time periods, and it's sort of close enough to like who we were yesterday in any given day. And in that sense, we do have kind of this essence of continuity, but at the same time, what we're doing is we're taking some of the sticks off and we're adding new sticks over and over and over, and kind of in the longer term, it's a little bit more like the ship of Theseus, and over a longer period of time, our identity of who we are is in flux. And perhaps the side of agency for us is our ability to decide which sticks to change out. We can't change 95% of ourselves, in a given day. But in a given day, if we change just a little bit of ourselves in a way that is intentional, we can move ourselves in a different direction. It's important to note that this model is consistent with how we understand neuroplasticity operate, which it operates over a short period of time. We have largely the same brain we did from one day to the next, but over time, and depending on how we attend to various things, our brains slowly change, adapting to the stimulus we give it. Now, I think we can do a little bit better than a bundle of sticks, and we don't think that's necessarily the best as a metaphor. A metaphor that can provide us with a little more artistry and intentionality is that of painting a canvas. The canvas is our identity, and it's already painted in. But every day, we can paint over it just a little bit. If we decide to take responsibility for who we are, we can, through our practice and attention, change the canvas a little bit every day. If we don't take responsibility and choose to be intentional, it isn't the case that we won't change, we will. Instead, it will merely be the case that the change will be one that we are not the authors of. And so here we wanted to have the bit about authenticity because I think a lot of people think that change is inherently inauthentic. And if you're changing in a way that you're trying to fulfill your values, you can have a authentic commitment to your values that sometimes necessitates that you change who you are. Okay, so alignment. Our chapter 1 idea is that if you don't control your attention, others will for you, alongside the imperative of engaging in stylization. We are pulled in two directions here. There's frustration and ambivalence regarding what we want. If we are pulled in two directions, but our plan requires us to do the thing that we don't feel like doing, then we will have to use willpower to overcome it. Implementation intentions is one strategy for doing this more effectively. Another strategy is our ability to create actions we want is creating alignment with regards to various aspects of our identity. For example, if you view yourself as a hairdresser, it is easier to motivate yourself to fix your hair before going out. That is to say, we want to make our values consistent with our roles and to some degree to which we find ourselves effective in them, with how we envision ourselves, both archetypes and prototypes. I don't know if we want to talk about stories here, but the idea is if we are, the role of guard is a role, the role of hairdresser is a role, so is the role of student. And if you view yourself, or let's say lifelong learner, if you view yourself as a lifelong learner, then it gets easier for you to motivate yourself to read more, right? But if you view yourself as an idiot, it will make it harder or idiot's not the right word, because a lot of people are intelligent and don't read books. But my point is that there's something that you could view yourself as that would make it harder for you to read books. There's some statistic 40% of people or something, or Americans, after they graduate their last tier of schooling, never complete another book again, which is, to me, absolutely crazy. Just an insane figure. Ooh, we showing off a little bit of the... One way to think of this is a metaphor for archery. We can frame our identity like an arrow, and attention is a bow that shoots it. I have no recollection of this metaphor. We can frame our identity like an arrow, and attention is the bow that shoots it. If the arrow isn't straight, then it won't fly straight. If the roles we perceive ourselves to occupy and the values we hold aren't aligned, then we will be pulled in two directions. The consequence is that we won't be able to organize the full efforts of our attention, the bow, to achieve what we want, hitting the target. To continue the analogy, we also want the wood of the arrow to be sturdy or dense. We want our values, roles, and stories to be clear. If the arrow isn't sturdy, then it will splinter on impact with a target instead of penetrating it. If we aren't clear about what's important regarding our values and who we are, then we're more likely to be fooled under uncertainty or resistance. Let's consider an example. Let's. Police reform has come to the forefront of national awareness in the United States recently. I wrote this around the time of the George Floyd stuff. What types of values inspire people to produce policing as a line of work? Some amalgamation of a sense of duty to the community, a desire to help others, and value and justice come to mind. These certainly seem commendable. So what exactly is going wrong? For our purposes, we're going to take a look at a very specific aspect of policing issues, which isn't to say it's the only issue, just that it illustrates the alignment. And that is, we're going to think about how tribalism affects policing, and in particular, the frame that a lot of police officers tend to occupy in terms of how they view themselves is they view themselves as a warrior. Now, this might not be as problematic for a soldier, but consider that the people who are policing / engaging with violence are the people that they've signed up to defend. So when a police goes out and engages with the community via policing, it's not that they are fighting some sort of enemy, but they are engaged with the very people that they are ostensibly trying to protect. Again, we invoke this Nietzsche quote regarding requiring enemies. A warrior frame is one that requires adversaries. And so when you have a warrior type framing, you are encouraged to make adversaries out of the very people you are policing. The problem with this is that this role just isn't appropriate. The 21st century, the President's Report on 21st Century Policing, which I would recommend if people, kind of care about the issue, it's like 80 pages long, it's not too bad, has a suggestion in the form of reframing. Reframing the job as being a guardian instead of being a warrior. And if that is the identity you view yourself as, this is going to make it so that, different types of cognitive distortions are going to happen, different types of cognitive dissonance is going to happen, and it's going to move you in a direction of behavior that is going to be less oriented towards viewing the people who you are aiming to police, avoid viewing them as the enemy, because they're not. The essential responsibility of a prison guard is to ensure that the prisoners stay and that they don't harm themselves or others. We can think of other roles where the primary responsibility is effectively the same, but the framing of the relationship guard-prisoner is entirely different. An example that might seem particularly absurd at first glance is a daycare worker and the child they're watching. That is kind of absurd. The daycare worker is responsible for holding the children, more than one, at a particular facility at such a time as they are released to their parent or guardian. Neither the prisoners nor children are allowed to check themselves out. That's true. It's important to make sure that the children are not in danger to themselves or others, and is considered particularly bad or distasteful if they allow the children to escape. This isn't to suggest that guards should view their prisoners as their children, and certainly not that daycare workers should view the children they watch as prisoners, but simply that they could. Perhaps police ought to view themselves as guardians rather than warriors. The point in this is that we can be flexible in the ways in which we interpret and tell our stories to ourselves, and that the way we tell ourselves the story matters. Making a distinction between between considering ourselves a warrior or a guardian may seem like a thing of fluff, but it's also the stuff. We like it when the fluff becomes the stuff. And then we wanted to have a rejoinder to the prison experiment, Zimbardo's prison experiment. The way in which we attend ourselves, how we perceive ourselves, informs our actions. Not just the actions we take, but the actions we view as being available, and also the actions which are going to cause cognitive dissonance. Let's maybe make a note. So the availability of actions, which actions are going to cause ego depletion or not, and which ones are going to cause cognitive distortions. Values are the guiding force. Now, this isn't to say values are immutable. What we've learned as identity is they change over time. But we can organize, our behavior, our actions, and our praxis around values. And then I think we make the argument that archetypes create alignment between values and identity. I'm not sure if I quite believe that. I think archetypes are just kind of a different way of... I think values, identity, and archetypes are kind of all different ways of kind of referring to the same thing, which is the storied ways in which we make sense of reality, which is like most intellectuals really hate astrology, but I think that. So I don't think astrology is accurate, but I think that astrology is performing a very important function that a lot of people just kind of, who are critical of it, gloss over, which is that it is giving you a model for making sense of realities such that you can navigate that reality. And I definitely think some archetypes are better than others. I think that the, like, Myers-Briggs is more useful probably than astrology, but each one of them are creating these archetypal images of people that don't exist in the abstract, and they're doing it in order to make sense of reality, and that making sense of reality is a useful thing, and can allow you to, organize your efforts in a more productive way, or might hurt your ability to do that. So, and then here we had, this is the rejoinder to the very beginning of the chapter, where we asked the person to complete the sentence stem, I am ... with 20 times or something. In the coming chapter, we're going to talk about roles, values, and archetypes. The little exercise at the start of the chapter can help us to understand why the car is loud outside and what area of focus might be appropriate. For each I am, we have the option of either picking a trait that describes us, intelligent, persistent, or strong, or a role that we might occupy, parent, mentor, teammate. We'll close that for now. Go back over what you wrote and tally up how many statements you made for each. If you had mostly traits, then you will tend to be more individualistic. If you had mostly roles, you'll tend to be more communal. Why is this important? This is the point of ingress and probably what you should focus on. If you are more individualistically focused, I think we're going to make the argument that you should focus on values. And if you are more communally oriented, you're probably going to want to focus more on roles. And I don't know why we're talking about intrinsic versus extrinsic here, but we also wanted to talk about it. This is all making sense, but I think from a pure writing perspective, the heavy reliance on the prison experience may be an issue. Yeah, it wasn't an issue when I thought the experiment was a little bit better. But I definitely will want to, like... The thing is the phenomena that's described with the Zimbardo experiment is still the phenomena that occurs. I will probably just use... There was this study that was done with elderly people, where they took them and they brought them back to they had them spend a vacation in a house where everything was like from the 1970s. So all the television shows were from the 1970s inside the house. The newspapers they got were from the 1970s. The cookware, just like literally everything. So it was like going in a time capsule to the past. And this might be the experiment that I use instead. But what's interesting about that one is nearly like every marker of health related to like feeling old or being old or this type of stuff was improved at the end of the study. And so the problem is this is less to do with roles specifically, but is still producing the effect of it being immersive is still a bit of an important one. And so it doesn't quite fit what I'm looking for. But there's been other studies other than the Zimbardo prison experiment, and maybe I could talk about Abu Ghraib more. In particular, the Zimbardo prison experiment was also never replicated under better conditions because it's not considered ethical. So, the if I rewrote it, I would probably try and figure out some way to extricate the Zimbardo prison experiment, or to heavily footnote that the experiment had some problems, with Zimbardo kind of getting lost in the sauce or trying to produce a particular type of result to further his career. Because that was very in vogue during the time of Zimbardo, was like explanations on how the Nazis were so evil. And the Milgram experiment was huge and like this type of thing. But summary time. Some aspects of our identity are particularly unstable. Of interest to us are the roles that we perceive ourselves to occupy. Our roles help to determine what actions we think of as available and appropriate, and of particular concern is informed by the roles in a way that might provide inconsistency with our values. There's a mixed bag for willpower. Some regard it as finite, but if we can achieve an alignment, we will have access to more, or that ego depletion occurs when we are less in alignment. This is kind of a jumble, which of course is why it's a parenthetical aside, but kind of the solution we came up with is looking at willpower as something that is maybe like infinite when you have alignment with your roles and this type of stuff, and is more finite when you don't have this alignment, such that producing alignment with your roles and identity and this type of stuff becomes important. Our roles pressure us both through cognitive dissonance and priming. Same type of social pressure that we saw in the Burns experiment. Also distortion to some extent, but okay. Identity can be thought of as painting, as a painting where we paint over the canvas of ourselves. Every day we can change slightly, and if we are intentional with what we want, we can slowly become that. In the short term, we can eliminate distractions and use pre-decisions as a means of decreasing the amount of willpower needed to take the actions we want to take. Long term, in order to decrease the amount of willpower we need for an action, we can seek alignment of our values, roles, and archetypes. And that's the chapter. You see that this is, if you go over the earlier chapters with us, which again is available on our Ideas YouTube, which is Generalist Ideas, it will be much better fleshed out than this. Towards the end of the book, it's a lot less fleshed out, and it's also going to be a lot less fleshed out because I think that we want to ditch the Zimbardo experiment, but that would require some work to extract that. Another thing is the Zimbardo experiment is so ubiquitous, and like I think if you're publishing an American book, in order for it to be labeled psychology, you actually have to include the Zimbardo and the Milgram experiment. So we would have to include it anyways, but we would maybe make it like less centrally important to some extent. I mean, usually we have a story of a particular person. I guess the story of the particular person at the point zero is the individual is reading. But we are having issues with car alarm outside, and we have gotten to the end of the book, and you guys aren't chatting too terribly much. So I think we're going to wrap this up here. I hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, feel free to like, comment, subscribe, except I think most of you are probably on the Twitch rather than the YouTube. But if you're on Twitch, we do have earlier chapters available in the VODs. The VODs on Twitch are by now long deleted. If you are interested, this type of thing. And yeah, I guess have a good one, you guys. Bye-bye, everyone.